We're delighted to announce the inaugural Robert M. Grace Leadership Symposium. This new initiative of the Preservation Foundation was generously underwritten by Mr. Grace's family and explores pertinent town issues in an effort to both educate and engage residents of the town of Palm Beach. To introduce this new symposium, we felt it was important to explore who Bob Grace was and what his contributions were to the town. Bob Grace was born in 1924 and grew up in Great Neck, New York. He was valedictorian at Lawrenceville and received multiple degrees from Yale.
He grew up sort of in a nice farm in Long Island, and my grandparents led a very casual lifestyle in the open country, and my grandmother had chickens that would go through the living room just open during the day, and my father had a pet pig that he used to travel with when he went on vacation. So he was very down-to-earth person. He was very serious about education. When he had been at Yale, he had been starting out with the idea of going to medical school after he graduated. And then the war started, and so he stopped doing that, and he was thinking about returning to medical school after the war, but I think my mother convinced him that she didn't want to be the wife of a doctor, who had to be on call, and it would be very hard. So he decided instead just to go into education. When he was a teacher at the day school, he only taught the 9th grade economics, and I think it only met once a week. And I remember that he was a very strict grader. Maybe 1 or 2 students might get an A- or a B. So he just felt that people, needed to apply themselves.
In addition to being a beloved educator in the community, some of his most significant contributions were during his service as a member of the town council for 14 years. During that time, he helped guide the town through one of the most intense development periods in its history.
My father's service to the town through various boards in the town council was the majority of my time growing up in Palm Beach. My dad had a very dry sense of humor and enjoyed wagering small amounts at different times with people about different topics when he was convinced that he was correct. So I know he had a particular wager with Judge Letts, Gavin Letts, in regards to some topic around town. There's a wooden paddle that has a $5 bill varnished into it on one side, and then on the other side it has the background to what the bet was. Actually, now that I'm remembering it, I think that the flip side of the paddle is an article actually from the Shiny Sheet, where my dad talks about how the only financial gain he ever had during the time he served on the council was that $5 bet with Judge Letts.
Public service was important to Bob Grace because he came from an old school philosophy that you gave back. And he did give back. You weren't paid to be on town council. He did it for years. He gave back. And so did his wife, Jane. She was an especially big philanthropist.
It was really the first time I really had an indication of how much the town meant to him. It started raining. Everybody else was running inside to get out of the rain. And he went outside and started walking up and down the streets. And I had no idea what he was doing. What he was doing was checking the drainage of the streets, because at a town council meeting that was coming up in the following week, he wanted to have the information that he needed. And that's the way he was with everything he did.
The first time I was aware of Bob Grace was early in having moved to Palm Beach in 71. There's this big Mysore fig tree, which still stands today here, thanks to Bob Grace. And I went to a town council meeting to plead on behalf of saving this Mysore fig tree, which was well over 100 years old, and just to make a parking lot out of it just didn't make sense to me. He took care of the tree, which I was grateful for, and put a tree ordinance in to protect historic trees, which is still there today, and those trees are all protected. And I think there was about 76 of them at the time.
It was not long before I started calling Bob Grace Mr. Zoning, because that's what he was most interested in. Bob was interested in preserving the town through its zoning code, and he was very instrumental in adopting and seeing, too, the adoption of codes which would preserve the town as it was.
It was at that time in the 1970s when we had lost a lot of our grand estates. There was a trend towards smaller homes and high-density properties. So we can see a lot of condo development happening at this time, as well as the larger estates coming down for more single-family homes in those spaces.
And there was a concern that Palm Beach would quickly go the way of Singer Island or Miami Beach and mostly be characterized by these high-rise buildings.
We did the first rezoning of the town. And then when Bob came in, we did more rezoning, and Bob was probably most instrumental in that.
Bob saw the potential of the South End becoming a Miami Beach or a Riviera Beach because of the opportunity for the heights of those condos to increase. And he made certain that we passed an ordinance that restricted the height of the condos in the South End to 5 stories.
I think we can give Bob a lot of credit for the way the code was written when he was in charge, that it was the green space and the parking that controlled everything. If you look up and down the coast of Florida and you start in Miami and you see how little green space there is, Bob made sure that our condos, when the South End was being developed, that there was green space around all those buildings. It looks nothing like the developments further south of us. And he was able to stop it. And he stopped it with green space, and he stopped it with parking requirements. And I thank him every day for that.
Yeah, the parking and the open space were very important aspects to my father. The open space, whether it was keeping the Breakers golf course intact and not having it developed the way it had been proposed at one time, or keeping the par 3 down at the south end of town, and then the proportion of open space to built space on lots was something that they put into the zoning code. So that was a very important element.
After the hurricane of 1928, when a lot of the buildings were destroyed and the architects looking around realized that they would have to control the redevelopment after the hurricane. And they really wanted to have their hand in all the development happening to make sure it was all cohesive. However, the art jury didn't last very long. It was really kind of disbanded throughout the late 30s and early 40s throughout World War II, and never really came back after World War II. In 1970, when Bob Grace made it to town council, they decided to reenact the art jury as the Architectural Commission, and this is what we know today as ARCOM.
He was very instrumental in initiating the what we call the ARCOM ordinance, so that the Architectural Commission could look at every building that was going to be constructed to make sure it was in keeping with the other places in the North End.
We had some contentious hearings about development and redevelopment in the North End, and he would occasionally appear at the zoning, back then it was called the Zoning Commission hearings, and sort of be our guiding light. He would help keep us focused on what our goal was, what our mission was.
There are people that say that our code is so tough now that you could not build the landmarks we already have. And in a sense, that's true, but when those buildings were built, there was an architectural commission. It was actually called the Art Jury, and it was comprised of Addison Meisner, John Volk, Maurice Fazio, Wyeth, Shoemate. They all served time on this art jury, but they were judging their peers, and they were doing it respectfully, and none of it was in-your-face McMansion, too big, oversized. They work in their own little environment, and they are excellent architecture. And what happens is when it's not being judged properly and you don't have the best architect, you can end up with a disaster. I mean, there still are a few of those disasters from the 20s, but we kind of look the other way and put a hedge around it. You know, Frank Lloyd Wright said that doctors are lucky. They get to bury their mistakes. Architects can only put a vine on it.
It's interesting that Bob Grace wanted to create the Architectural Commission prior to the creation of the Landmarks Preservation Commission here in the town of Palm Beach when he was at town council in the 1970s. And it wasn't until about 10 years later that the Landmarks Preservation Ordinance came into being in 1979, which he also helped codify.
My mother was Barbara Hofstadt. She and Mr. Grace clearly were concerned with the future of Palm Beach. And my mother had been active in the Preservation Foundation in Pittsburgh. And so my mother began in Palm Beach, as she had in Pittsburgh, cataloging significant buildings in Palm Beach. And she did the first architectural survey of Palm Beach. And she did that privately. I mean, those days, life was easier. She would get on her bicycle and take her Hasselblad and just go in anyone's driveway and take pictures of the houses. And then that led to her book, Landmark Architecture of Palm Beach, which I think was published around 1974.
The Landmarks Ordinance was really written by Henry Hofstadt, who was Barbara Hofstadt's husband, who lived in New York, and he patterned it after an ordinance in New York, I believe. And that's where we got that ordinance, and we were successful in defending against that ordinance, thank goodness.
The earliest form of the art jury was really created so they could control the development and the character of the town. And I think Bob Grace played off of that when he started his zoning goals as a town council member and later as a zoning commission. And he even coined the term town serving when it came to protecting local businesses.
He was a good speaker. And I was reading one of his speeches that really says it all. Can I read a little of it to you? We feel that this trend is left to continue unchecked, and that was sudden growth of the town. A lot more of our small town charm will disappear. In an effort to pressure the town at this year's zoning meetings, your zoning commission and town council adopted the concept of town serving as a zoning category. Town serving means just what it says. It is a commercial zone which is supposed to serve mainly the needs of the people who live in town.
When he thought about town serving and the preservation of Palm Beach, my parents traveled around the world, not excessively, but often, and they would go to different cities, and he would say, oh, look at these, beautiful architectural buildings that we're going to, but they don't have any life to them anymore. They have no function. Nobody uses them. And he wanted to keep Palm Beach as a place where everything was beautiful, but also still functional and serving the residents.
Bob Grace was very interested in having small local businesses here. We all were, because that's what keeps it from being a resort, makes it a town where people live. The gas station needed money, and he loaned. That was the kind of way Bobby Grace was.
The correspondence between my mother and Mr. Grace in the late 1970s was particularly prescient about the change of the town and the fact that development was being unchecked everywhere, and that key elements of life in the small town were disappearing. There was no hardware store. The gas station was down to one. My mother pointed out that you could buy jewelry, you could buy a $1,000 cocktail dress in 1979, but you couldn't buy an ice pick.
I think my father thought it was important for residents to be able to accomplish a lot of their everyday activities here in the town with as little ease as possible, without having to fight traffic, without having to, see construction taking place everywhere and blocking their way, and without having buildings that block their views of a beautiful vista. What he wanted to see life, in a beautiful fashion in this town. I mean, he had a strong belief that Palm Beach was a unique and special place and that it deserved protection.
Bob's goal was to keep it a small town, not a resort town, and to keep it one in which generations, frankly, of family members could grow up in.
When he was in office, all the town councilmen appeared to me to be very bold and strong-minded and willing to stand up for what they believed in. And I think they were a group of like-minded individuals. Even if they had taken different paths to get to the town council, they all felt similarly. And so I don't know if that's what made them strong or they were strong individually, but my father, I know in particular, had no difficulty standing up before developers and saying, this is not what's allowed. He felt very strongly about not granting variances, and he used to go check out every project to see what it looked like and to try and find out what the reality of the situation was.
A variance is someone who wants to do something with their property that is not in compliance with the town code, such as height, such as setback, such as lot coverage, etc. But the law requires, the ordinance requires, that you have to show a hardship in order to get a variance. And that hardship is not just that it's something you want or that it's costing you money. I was just so impressed with the manner in which he went about preserving the town. He was very pleasant, but he was very strict. And I recall the people coming in for variances being a little bit nervous about appearing before Bob Grace because they knew how strict he was going to be.
He was a wonderful man. He was a wonderful friend, and he did more for this town than I can imagine anybody else would have been able to do. He was not on the town council for 20 years, but probably very close to that. And that longevity during the expansion of the town at the time was just very important.
No matter who you were, he had that sense. He cared very much. And like I said, he was always prepared for any meeting thing. He had a wicked sense of humor, too. One day before a council meeting, about 30 minutes before, he was talking to someone, and someone came up and interrupted him. A very aggressive man came in and interrupted him, and he said, "I hope tonight the council talks about the rats in the North End." He looked at the guy and he said, "The two-legged ones or the four-legged ones?" And obviously, the guy did not know what to say after that.
My dad cared a lot about the town of Palm Beach, and I thought by doing the symposium, we could at least continue some of those beliefs that he had and that he cherished and that he cared about, so that they wouldn't disappear, so that they would be continued in some form for posterity.
From my perspective and my other family members' perspective, that a symposium to try and stimulate people to think about preservation and what they could do to keep the town as a good place, the way it's always been, is something important. And so if there's anything that you can do to awaken people to the differences between now and before and get them to contemplate the future, I think that's very helpful.